Welcome to episode 20 of Chatting with Ingram. Today I'm talking to John Cammegh, who's a QC with 36 Crime, and we're on a fascinating subject of international law. Warning, you will definitely learn something. John, fantastic. Great to have you on Chatting with Ingram. Can you, for the listeners out there, before we get into talking about international criminal justice, whether it actually exists, its strengths, its weaknesses, your viewpoints on it, can you just tell the listeners who you are and where you fit in?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Philip. My name's John Cammegh. I'm a QC at 36 Crime in London, and I've had a fairly sort of eclectic career because I got silk primarily on the basis of a domestic criminal practice, but I was very lucky. It was about 15 years ago now, more than that, 16 years ago, to be asked to take on a case in Sierra Leone, in the Special Court of Sierra Leone, which at the time was one of the longest running war crimes trials there had ever been. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of projected from this, very standard criminal, mainly defense practice in the Southeast, projected into this fascinating post-war country, defending someone in a trial that was the first in history to charge things like the use of child soldiers, forced marriage, sexual slavery, abduction of UN peacekeeping forces, not to mention all the allegations of mass murder, mutilation, etc., etc. And after 5 years of that, I was asked to take part in a very sinister trial in Dhaka in Bangladesh, which referred to the 1971 genocide there, which was highly politically motivated. It was chalk and cheese compared to Sierra Leone. I actually ended up spending a lot of time in Washington talking to very important people there, from the congressional houses to the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. So a very sort of broad panoply of experience there. And, you're posing that very sort of nebulous question, is there such a thing as international criminal justice? Very difficult to set the parameters. But I have to say that my experience is that it is subjective. It is riven with ulterior motives. And when you look on the ground, if you look at it in a sort of microcosm, taking each trial individually, it's very difficult to say that it purveys the kind of justice that people aspired to at the outset.
So would you from a lawyer's perspective who's been involved in it from the front line perspective, say that rather than justice coming out in a lot of the different cases, it's the furtherment of whatever political will that is in power at that moment in time, and it furthers their political objectives rather than getting to the nub of what would be a purely justice-related outcome if things were fair?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I could talk to you for hours citing a plethora of examples of events that took place in both those trials that demonstrated to me unequivocally that the results were preordained. In a nutshell, the Sierra Leonean trial was the product of a bipartisan or sort of bipartite agreement between the UN Security Council and the Sierra Leonean government. Mm-hmm. And although parties were tried in that case from both sides of the divide from the Civil War, those pro-government and against the government, the RUF, you found, a huge disproportionality in the way that those convicted or those government forces, the way they were treated, having been convicted, in contrast to those who were trying to topple the government. Mm-hmm. Those toppling the government, the revolutionaries, were treated far, far more egregiously. The same with the Bangladesh case. I mean, this was a political vehicle from the start, and it was designed really to rid the country of the high-ranking political Islamist party and their figureheads, which it did. They were all hanged. So this sense of victor's justice, I'm afraid, has always been, it became a bit of a cliche, but sadly it was quite true. In the cases that I was involved in, it was hard to escape the notion that it was the winners that made the justice, because it's the winners that make the history.
Mm. But was it never always thus? If we look back at Nuremberg, that was very one-sided. It was all the Nazis that were being prosecuted, and rightly so, for the crimes that they committed. But it was a major conflict. I'm sure there were individuals or groups on the Allied forces side that will have committed what could have been classed as war crimes, and we didn't see the same sort of justice coming out there. So is international justice always just politically motivated, and it's the person in power or the winners that are the ones that set the rules?
I think that's the case. I mean, if you look at World War II, there have been arguments, not one that I subscribe to, but Arthur Harris and his bombing campaign, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are arguments to frame those actions within the ambit of crimes against humanity, the Geneva Conventions, etc., etc., could equally apply, if you'd been on the winning side, to people who committed those crimes. But the key is, it's the winners who always get to write that script.
Yeah.
And I found that deeply frustrating. You see, I mean, Sierra Leone is probably the most interesting example, because it was designed to found or to establish the rule of law and a sense of humanitarian justice above all, in a country that I think for many years prior to my arrival in 2004 had been at the very bottom of the World Health Organization's list of developed countries.
Yep.
This is a country that was smashed. It had no roads, it had no healthcare, it had no running water, it had no electricity. The electricity that powered the court would have been sufficient to power the whole of Freetown, as Freetown was at that time. And you just sense that it was a vehicle that it had lofty ideals to start with. We are going to teach the Sierra Leonean political parties how to run a democracy. But unfortunately, it betrayed itself with a series of unjust decisions and unjust convictions, which for me and for many other people, I'm afraid, just flew in the face of its credibility. And so often with various tribunals around the world, particularly the ad hoc tribunals, that has proved to be the case. And it begs a question, where do we go from here? You're talking about a period of time where there was money. Countries within the General Assembly, the Security Council, had the money to donate to these enterprises. But I think that will kind of withered on the vine a bit as donors began to see that these trials overran, they way outspent their budgets, and there was this nagging feeling that justice wasn't properly being done. And that's one of the reasons I would think why there are fewer of these ad hoc tribunals around the world right now. And I think they're going to continue to dwindle. And when you look at the fact that the ICC, there are many major countries who are not signatories, the US, China, India, the clout that international criminal justice has going forward, for me, looks like it can only diminish.
Do you think that would fuel, therefore, the approach of some of these major countries that aren't signatories to use a more offensive style of immediate justice whenever they're dealing with people that they couldn't be bothered wasting the time and getting them into international courts in the future? I look at the way Osama bin Laden was dealt with. It wasn't kill or capture, it was kill. You look at the way the Iranian Quds Force commander Soleimani was dealt with in Iraq, and that wasn't kill or capture, that was kill. Do you think there's, and with precision weapon systems and precision special forces that are out there, do you think there's a greater desire, therefore, by some of the leading international countries to end up with that hard result so that they don't have this problem that goes on for years?
Well, it's quick, it's clean. I don't want to sound cynical, but it is quick, it is clean. No questions are asked afterwards. And I guess those in command would say that it works. I mean, if you look at ISIS, I don't see too many international war crime tribunals starting up with ISIS in mind. Instead, there was a far more pragmatic, militaristic policy, which fortunately was successful. But I think you're probably right. I think, you know, when you look at the international criminal justice as I was introduced to it, the model that was sold to me, it was as much about nation building as it was about a sense of, you know, retribution. It imported a sense of truth and reconciliation. It imported mass assistance and intervention from the NGOs, the NGO industry, as I somewhat cynically used to call it in Sierra Leone, because there certainly was that aspect to it.
There's definitely an industry around NGOs. That's a completely different podcast, I think.
Yeah. And I don't want to get too controversial, but I think you're right. Now, but the countries that you've just referred to tend to be those who are probably closed to any sense of humanitarian assistance, involvement, influence, and therefore a quick, clean kill seems to be the more expedient way of dealing with those.
So you know, during that time, from a historical perspective, who are the International Criminal Court? Who's designed them? Who do they answer to? Who sets the rules and the laws that they are supposed to apply, and who gives them that oversight that's supposedly trying to bring in justice but is enabling the political outcomes to be pushed?
Well, the ICC was set up pursuant to the Rome Statute, and it has its own authority. Its authority is invested, of course, by the UN Security Council. But you see, it's a good question, because the question itself sort of points the finger at the ICC and the Security Council, and challenges them to answer something that I don't think they've ever answered satisfactorily. And the reason they're unable to answer it is because, in my view, unless they had a massive global consensus, it is very difficult for them to claim absolute moral authority over, you know, the dispensation of criminal justice around the world. And the reason I say that, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the ICC that it's very Africa-centric. There's been a lot of criticism of the ICC also that it's very Eurocentric. Africa-centric in the fact that the vast majority of trials there have involved African states and African individuals. Eurocentric because, of course, the apparatus and the decision-making, if you like, the governance of the ICC is all based in the Netherlands. And although I think it is tremendously diverse, and that's one of its great successes, it still finds it difficult, I think, to dislodge this notion that, you know, it's a white man's court which dispenses justice to you know, the black nations in Africa. And that is something that I think it's still got a long way to move away from. Now, put that on one side and consider also that when you've got a country like the United States that has steadfastly refused to join, when you've got countries, very vastly populous countries, that are starting to shape world affairs more than anybody else, India, and primarily, of course, China.
Yes.
You really have to ask, well, not so much what is the point of the ICC, but what are its terms of reference going to be going forward? Because a lot of the instability that we are likely to see throughout the developing world is going to be caused by this new imperialism, which stems from China. I mean, I haven't been in Sierra Leone for 10 years, but I do remember things changed very drastically there. The last year or two I was there, the Chinese had a very sinister embassy there. Big place. Nobody ever got in there. Kept themselves to themselves. And yet, as if by magic, their infiltration within Sierra Leonean society rose exponentially over the last 18 months or so that I was there. UNAMSIL, the peacekeeping force, had pulled out. There'd been one successful democratic election in, I think it was 2006. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was 6. And Sierra Leone was getting back on its feet. The NGOs were still there, but it effectively been taken off life support. And the Chinese moved in. How do they move in? Well, hotels and leisure facilities were built along the beaches overnight. Were they interested in hotels? No, they're interested in raw materials. Diamond mines, hitherto owned by mainly the Lebanese. Lebanese elbowed out, Chinese move in. I think there's bauxite there as well, other raw materials in Sierra Leone. And if you go through the entire continent, you see that China is getting stronger and stronger and stronger, taking raw materials, using Africa as a marketplace for its cheap, shoddy materials. Now, I saw what you would term on a I won't say human rights abuses, but I saw locals being treated terribly by their Chinese employers. And it concerns me that when we go through the 21st century, we are going to see more of this imperialism. It's going to be unchecked because politically there won't be the will, because China is going to be a massive trading partner. Judicially, there won't be the means, because they will never succumb to any sense of modern day criminal justice. It's going to be a problem.
Well, there's a couple of things come out of that. The Chinese influence is growing massively, and it's with the raw materials, and in this modern world with rare earth metals, which are needed for all of our electronics and everything else. And their influence into Africa, where some places there's only one mine to provide that's commercially viable to provide the rare earth metals that are needed, and it's owned by the Chinese, gives them a huge influence, and we're missing the growth that they're putting into Africa, but the influence that they've got across the globe as well. Again, this could be the subject of yet another podcast, but there's no accident that every technical university that there is in a Western country has got a very heavy Chinese student population, and in particular in the research population that's there. And they're not there necessarily just because of the quality of the education. And China is quietly growing its influence whilst around the rest of the world we're not noticing it. But that's because Xi Jinping, now that he's been put into power for life, effectively, can think and plan where China's going in multi-generational terms. And it's a one-party state, so he's got no opposition. So he can do that, whereas in the West, we're sitting there whizzing around in prime ministerial or presidential terms. And the reality is some of the big influencers are whizzing around in what's the latest tweet terms in planning timelines. And therefore, any country that can think in multi-generations is going to outthink and outplay and out-influence that's going on around the world. And we're not noticing it. But coming back to the legal side of things. If the International Criminal Court is like that, how do you, from a lawyer's perspective, technically, what law do you apply? And how do you then, where does a court draw its authority from when it comes to sentencing people and authority to then carry out those sentences?
Well, it is its own authority. So the statute of the ICC defines the crimes. These crimes, the ingredients of those crimes are agreed by states parties, the signatories, and they're sort of mutually agreed. They accord with sort of modern standards of what you would expect to have to prove in terms of separate crimes against humanity and what have you. So there's nothing really controversial about the crimes themselves. There's nothing really controversial about the way they're investigated. The ICC has its own sort of independent investigatory arm. There's nothing controversial about the way that individuals are arrested and taken into custody, because ordinarily they will be citizens of states parties or of states which have invited the ICC to extend their jurisdiction into that state. Examples of non-states parties who have invited the ICC in, so to speak, would be the Ukraine in recent years, Palestine, the Ivory Coast was another one.
Okay.
In fact, their former leader, Laurent Gbagbo, was acquitted last year. So, it's a network of mutual agreement and mutual assistance. And it's from that mutual agreement, signatories to the Treaty of Rome, that they get the authority. That authority invested from high by the Security Council.
Okay.
So that's how it works on paper.
Yes.
But I say, going back, if I can just refer back to China, China poses an existential threat. It poses a militaristic threat towards Taiwan.
Yes.
It imposes internal threats with its treatment of the, I never know how to pronounce this properly.
The Uyghur population, the Chinese Muslim minority.
Yeah. Which is actually a place I've been to 20 years ago now.
Okay.
And I saw it with my own eyes. Who is going to police that? Nobody.
Well, nobody's doing it at the minute because we know for a fact what is going on. And China's saying, are just doing what they always do and saying, no, we're not doing that. We're re-educating people. Right, next, let's sign the trade deal.
But by the same token, or through that same reasoning, because the US has never been a signatory or state party to the ICC, those responsible for the Iraq war can never be invited to face justice. Tony Blair could never be invited to face justice.
But the UK is a signatory, so
well, they were a signatory, but in 2006 the ICC ruled that they didn't have jurisdiction, or that the decision to enter the Iraq war fell outside the ICC jurisdiction. And once they make that decision, unless the actual state party itself, in this case the UK, takes a decision to prosecute, then it's dead in the water. So, the authority is there, but only when a country is available to submit to it or willing to submit to it. That's the issue. And some countries that are signatories to it, if the ICC makes a ruling like that, if the individual prosecution authorities in that country choose not to institute a prosecution, then that's as far as it will go. So do you think it's a little bit toothless?
Yeah. Do you think that's why the Iraqis chose to prosecute Saddam Hussein whenever they captured him, rather than have him released out to the international courts? Do you think this was political pressure from the United States and the UK? Because if that had happened, it would set a precedence that would mean that they would recognise the international courts.
That's a very good question, and I don't honestly know the answer. My impression at the time was, and you may know more about this than me, Philip. My impression at the time was that the Iraqis deserved to be given the right to try Saddam Hussein on their own soil according to their own criminal standards.
Yeah.
And I remember that trial pretty well. I think it probably had more in common with the Bangladesh trial that I was involved in terms of, rules of procedure, or rather the total lack of.
And part of the reason why I asked the question of this is at the very beginning you talked about the ICC partially being there to nation build, and if you look at what happened during the Iraq War, when the Allies went in, it completely dismantled the elements of Iraq that you would need to provide that the framework for a nation. So you're the civil service, the justice system, the police, and all the rest of it. So when it came to Saddam Hussein being prosecuted in his own country, it wasn't a mature, well thought through new system that was there. It was something that had been hastily cobbled together by a series of different factions that didn't get on well with each other and couldn't agree politically. But it was a good way of potentially trying to reunite the country because of the Ba'athist minority that there was. Whether it had that effect or not, only history will tell.
Well, I remember very well because I was out in Sierra Leone at the time, and I was much more aware of what was going on in the international criminal justice world then, for obvious reasons. I was part of it, and my sense of it was that trial fermented tremendous hatred. We all remember the hell that Iraq slipped into around those times,
and is arguably still there.
Yeah, well, again, you would know more about that than me. It just isn't on the front pages anymore, is it?
Yeah,
that's the difference. I think that was typical, or a perfect example of how that entire enterprise wasn't thought through from the start. Consequences were not considered, not thought through, and a decade of bloodletting was the result, and probably still continuing. Should he have been tried in his own country? Should he have been tried abroad? I think it would have denied the Iraqis who'd suffered under him for so long the opportunity to, deal or dispense justice in the way they saw fit if he'd been taken out. But it's a very squalid period in.
Well, yeah, and interesting. The international community's rationale for going to war was the international threat that he posed through having possessed weapons of mass destruction, allegedly, through having threatened stability in the region. And therefore, if I'd have thought that the international community would have wanted to prosecute him for all of those failures under international law, which is what was used to justify the war, rather than the domestic issues, which wasn't used to justify the war. We didn't go in on a humanitarian mission to save the Iraqis who were being oppressed. And therefore, it seemed a little duplicitous that the legal system that prosecuted him wasn't for the rationale from the organisation that provided the rationale to go and remove him from power in the first place.
And I'm sure they would have got permission from the rulers that they installed to do that. But as I said, it wasn't thought through. Just as the entry into the war wasn't properly thought through, was it?
Well, again, I think that we can make that as part of another podcast as we look forward to, because there's a lot of views on there at the moment. And actually, I looked at the one of the international websites that counts casualties since then, and you're putting it into context. We look at the casualties that there are with COVID-19, naturally occurring pandemic that's gone through, and you look at the casualties that there have been, the civilian casualties that there have been through the Iraq War up until today, and there's people still dying today, and the body count in Iraq is over 200,000 civilians, and that probably doesn't take into account the fact that war helped create the so-called Islamic State. So you've then got the body count that'll go through Syria and elsewhere. So it is significant as a man-made disaster, whereas the pandemic is a global natural disaster. Yet they're baying for people's blood for the pandemic planning.
And I could draw a contrast here. I remember earlier on I told you you asked for the authority of the ICC, and I said ultimately it came from the Security Council. The Security Council set it up, invested in its powers and its authority. It would have been possible for the provisional government that took over from Saddam Hussein to say to the ICC, we invite you in to, try this man and his henchmen for years of atrocities in this country. They could have done that. A rather unfortunate way of doing it was used instead. I get the reasons why. It was it was a populist approach, but it would at least have played things by the book. It's ironic that the very act of going to war, particularly from Britain, a signatory to the ICC, undermined the Security Council, the Security Council being the body that underpins the ICC, because of course they never got the Security Council's blessing to go to war.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned just now duplicity or double standards. We see it, and we like to think of ourselves as a shining example of democracy, of the rule of law, and a country that's happy to export that or try to export that around the world. We failed signally to do that, both in going into that war without the necessary justifications, and the way we allowed, or perhaps failed to prevent, the mess that resulted from it by ensuring that Saddam Hussein was tried in a more orderly fashion, because that trial in itself created, as you know, division, hatred, violence, sectarianism that's probably still going on today.
Oh, very much so, and we're suffering from it. And it was one of the rationales behind the success of so-called Islamic State. But John, I know that we're tight for time today, and we're coming to the end of this, and that seems like a good point to stop, because we can pick that up in part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5. I think we could easily fill those without any problems whatsoever. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you on today on Chatting with Ingram.
Well, my pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot, Philip.